So Chapter 18 of Two Blue Vortex has officially been out for a couple of days now. And while the big twist of Chapter 18 is that a character that we haven't seen since the Chunin exams in Part 1 has a sword that allows him to use magnet release, kind of. That doesn't mean that Chapter 18 was a complete throwaway of a chapter. As in actuality, the real big event of Chapter 18 is the fact that the battle between the Shinju and Team 7 2/3 has finally begun to kick off. But we knew that was gonna happen eventually. I mean, that's just basic storytelling. And that's kind of what Chapter 18 was for Two Blue Vortex. It got all the things that we knew had to happen, and now we're just waiting for the more important, cooler things to happen now that the mandatory beginning stuff has already gotten out of the way. As in Konoha, we also saw a storyline begin to unfold that we already knew was in the works, as Kawaki tried to force Amado to respec him from a defensive build to an offensive build, and Amado put Kawaki to sleep and introduced him to a new version of his daughter that he's trying to have Kawaki place karma marking on to bring his daughter Akebi back to life. But once again, these are all kind of things that we knew were happening. We knew from the get-go when Amado placed a new karma marking on Kawaki that he was doing so that one day Kawaki would place a karma marking on a clone of Akebi or a Delta so that Amado could use the power of the karma marking to bring his daughter back to life. However, as straightforward as some of the other happenings seem from Chapter 18, the reveal of the new Akebi clone and Kawaki telling Amado that he's not going to place that karma marking on her until he defeats all of his enemies like Boruto, Code, and the Shinju has ironically done a lot more for the future of the plot of Two Blue Vortex than even the beginning of the battle between Ryu Matsuri and Team 7 2/3. But why and how? Well, because the way that the events unfolded between Amado and Kawaki gave us a massive hint about how this story is going to end. A hint that not only revealed a little bit of Ikemoto's hand, but also possibly revealed to us the two final villains of Boruto's Two Blue Vortex and how they're going to come to be. Yes, that's right, because I genuinely believe the events of Chapter 18 of Two Blue Vortex have shown us once and for all that Akebi and Amado will be the final villains of Boruto. And as absolutely insane as that sounds, trust me, there's a rationale to all of it. And today, my goal is to make you understand that rationale. But before I get to breaking anything down for you guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. But before we get into all that, today we gotta talk about our favorite recurring sponsor to the page, Grüns. Now, with an all-new package. Yes, that's right, Grüns got a rebrand. Listen, being healthy doesn't have to be boring, and I love that the outside of Grüns' new packaging looks as fun and energetic as their gummies make me feel. But don't worry, what's truly important, the Grüns formula hasn't changed at all. They're still packing all the vitamins, supplements, and green nutrients you need and want in delicious gummy bears, with high quality and natural ingredients. See, Grüns is the kind of company that recommends you read their ingredients list. While other supplement companies feel shame about it, Grüns puts it in big, bold letters right here in the back. But for those of you who haven't got on the Grüns wave yet, what are these exactly? Well, they're a convenient and comprehensive formula packed into 8 gummy bears a day. They're not a multivitamin, a greens gummy, or even a probiotic. It's all of those things and then some at a fraction of the price. And they taste so good, you'll wish you could have 2 packs a day. And honestly, who's gonna stop you? 8 gummies are included in every snack pack because you can't fit this many nutrients in just one gummy. Trust me. They probably tried. And while generic multivitamins only include 7 to 9 vitamins, Grüns offers 20 plus vitamins and minerals, made from 60 plus whole food ingredients. But there's a lot more than just jamming as many ingredients in here as possible going on with Grüns. Grüns specifically takes care to dose their ingredients effectively. That is to say that when they give you a vitamin, they want you to get 100% of your daily recommended dose of that vitamin, because certain minerals and vitamins are known to be toxic at above 100% the recommended dose. And Grüns wants to make sure that your body is operating at 100% efficiency. So what are you guys waiting for? Taking care of yourself should be fun and tasty.
To get up to 52% off your Grüns order today, use the link in my description.
This is my second pack today. So, the events of Chapter 18 have set up a couple of interesting timelines that we have to keep an eye on as Two Blue Vortex enjoyers. The most important of which ties back to a man that's kind of taken a backseat in part 2 of Boruto's story, Amado. See, as we all saw in Chapter 18, the first second that Amado got the chance, he put Kawaki to sleep, proving that Amado has a sleep code for Kawaki like he has for Delta and possibly all of his other cyborgs. And when Kawaki awoke from his forced slumber, him and Amado had a conversation. A conversation that surrounded the idea of Amado converting Kawaki's nearly limitless defensive power into possibly nearly limitless offensive power. Something that Amado said that he would do as he didn't foresee the creation of the Shinju and understand that they needed to be destroyed, but something that he didn't want want to do until Kawaki placed his karma marking on the freshly cloned Akebi. Now, from Amado's perspective, this is a very rational ask. The only reason that Amado placed the empty karma marking on Kawaki, and I'll tell you why that's in quotation marks in a little bit, was one, so that Kawaki could get the power back that he had lost when Ishiki died, and two, so that eventually Kawaki would use that karma marking to bring Akebi back to life. On top of that, because of the structure of this deal, if Kawaki dies, so effectively does Akebi, as Amado has nobody else to place a karma marking on. Amado doesn't have the ability to create a karma marking. The only reason he was able to replace the karma marking on Kawaki is because Kawaki had already fully Otsutsukified and at one point had a fully awakened karma marking. Amado likened this process to a house being built with a door, but that house losing its door. The door was Ishiki, but now that the house doesn't have a door, the house is still there. So Amado was able to reinstill the power of the house inside of Kawaki. Nobody else in existence is in that exact same position as Kawaki, so this is an incredibly advantageous setup for Amado. And thus Kawaki is incredibly important to Amado. That's why he maxed out his defensive capabilities to a level that apparently makes Kawaki nigh immortal. However, now Kawaki wants to no longer be nigh immortal and instead be nigh unstoppable. However, Amado's afraid that the switching of Kawaki's stats from defensive over to offensive may kill him, and on top of that, if Kawaki does survive this transfer of power, Kawaki's defensive and regenerative abilities will be way lower than they currently are, which means there's a high possibility that Kawaki could die in combat against the Shinju, and thus Amado would like Kawaki to place his karma marking on this freshly cloned Akebi as soon as possible, because the second that Kawaki places that karma marking, well, Amado effectively no longer needs him. He can fly off and die in combat against Jura for all that Amado cares. Now, obviously, that wouldn't be advantageous for Amado, or anybody for that matter, because at that point, Kawaki could be eaten, turned into a divine tree, and then Earth could be gone. But still, in a short-term goal perspective, Kawaki wants Amado to place that karma marking as soon as possible. But Kawaki does not want the same thing. See, Kawaki believes that there's a fair chance that when he places this karma marking on the freshly cloned Akebi, that she could Otsutsify. And since fundamentally that's how a karma marking works, it slowly but surely turns a life form into an Otsutsuki until they're eventually 100% Otsutsified, at which point they become the vessel of a reincarnation of a dead Otsutsuki. That's not the craziest conclusion to come to. However, the only reason that karma markings do that in the first place is because they have the DNA and chakra of an Otsutsuki. That is to say that karma markings act as a backup file for an Otsutsuki, and they need to make sure that the new vessel that they're going to have is compatible with their hardware, or their software. I guess the body would be the hardware. Anyways, Kawaki's fear that Akebi is going to Otsutsify has stopped him from placing this karma marking on Akebi right now, as Kawaki thinks that right now, as he's embroiled in this conflict with the Shinju and Code and Boruto, would be the worst possible time to introduce a new possible target in the freshly revived Akebi. Now, fundamentally, this doesn't make a huge amount of sense. One, because if Akebi did actually start to become Otsutsified from the presence of this karma marking, the entire Otsutsufication process would take months that Kawaki would have to kill Akebi and maybe even Amado whenever he wanted. And two, there's not even technically a guarantee that Akebi will survive the karma implantation process. As we learned from Jigen and Amado that thousands of kids died from the process of Jigen trying to finally get a karma marking on one of them. But Kawaki's line of logic here is establish the fact that if Akebi is brought back, which she absolutely will be, she won't be brought back until the end of the story, after Kawaki has defeated the Shinju and Code and Boruto. And with the likelihood of Kawaki defeating all three of those enemies is next to zero, as there's literally no chance that Kawaki kills Boruto, at least again. This means that Akebi will most likely be brought back after Boruto and Kawaki have their fight, and after Kawaki learns his lesson that Boruto's trying to punch into him. And because of the dialogue exchanged in this chapter, and the fact that Amado can't force Kawaki into placing a karma marking, there is currently no plot or narrative reason that Akebi would come back into the story any sooner than after Kawaki and Boruto's fight, as it's now been established that the only way in which Akebi is coming back to life is if either Kawaki changes, loses, or wins. And in that moment alone, Amado will get what he wants. But why set up Akebi's revival for the end of the story? To avoid introducing a new character? I mean, there's tons of characters that are currently not getting screen time. Why introduce another one and possibly take screen time away from other characters who need it, like Daemon and Ada? Or could it be to give Amado a reason to stay in the story? Because once Akebi is revived, I mean, I guess he could just say peace out and leave Konoha forever. And quite honestly, either of those explanations do make an okay amount of sense. But at the same time, how much screen time would Akebi really need? Akebi would presumably be treated as a character on the same level of importance as somebody like Sumire, or maybe even lower. So what would she need to be in? 1-2 pages every 2 chapters? That's not that much screen time. That's hardly a reason not to bring her back to life. On top of that, it's not like if Akebi got brought back to life that Amado would leave Konoha. Amado is currently receiving asylum and protection and holds a somewhat high-level position within the confines of Konoha. If Akebi was brought back to life right now, not only would Amado still kind of be a criminal seeking asylum from Kara, the Shinju, and Code, the absolute safest place for both him and his newfound daughter, his only apparent reason for living, would still be smack dab in the middle of Konoha. And thus if Akebi was brought back to life, Amado probably wouldn't go anywhere, which means we're only really left with one option. One real reason that Akebi can't be brought back right now. And that one real option is that if she was brought back, she would alter the story in a huge way. Now, it could absolutely be argued that Akebi's revival is simply going to act as a closing beat for Amado's story. Uzumaki family is going to be reunited, Himawari is going to connect with Kurama, and Amado is going to get Akebi back. I mean, that's fair, right? All the characters from Konoha should get a happy ending to their story, Amado included. Right? No, not right at all. Amado is not a sympathetic character like all of the other characters in Konoha. Not only is he perpetually suspicious, he's also the creator of the cyborgs that are currently plaguing the globe. Yeah, he created Kashin Koji to fight against Jigen and possibly end Dishiki's rule of terror, but he also helped Jigen kidnap and murder through the medium of karma implantation hundreds of children. Amado is by far and away a worse character morally than Orochimaru was in Naruto. And yeah, he betrayed Jigen in the end, and he was instrumental in his defeat, but one could argue that that feat lies more in the hands of Kashin Koji than it does Amado. So no, I don't think Akebi's revival is going to be a touching moment for the end of Amado's story, where we realize he was actually a good guy the whole time. Yes, he's technically just a father trying to do whatever he can to get his daughter back, but Edo Tensei is a forbidden jutsu for a reason. It goes against the laws of nature, and I'd argue that using alien technology to implant a backup drive of your daughter's memories and chakra into a freshly cloned version of her body also is probably a forbidden jutsu. On top of this, Amado has always been suspiciously motivated. Yes, he claims that the only reason he's doing any of the things that he's doing is to bring Akebi back to life, but parts of his story just don't line up correctly. See, Amado is always known a suspicious amount about the Otsutsukis. On top of this, Amado is known to have access to Shibai cells. I mean, literally every cyborg he's ever created has been implanted with Shibai cells, and while some of them never were able to manifest the Shinjutsu they were supposed to, this still means that Amado has access to Shibai's body. Now, the way that it's talked about, it seems as though Jigen is the reason that Amado has access to Shibai's body, but that's never 100% confirmed. On top of this, while Amado is supposed to be a traitor against Kara, some of his most prized creations, like Delta, have actively tried to kill people like Naruto and Himawari, people he's supposed to be sympathetic towards, considering the fact he wanted asylum in Konoha to begin with. And if we're going through with the ideology that Amado respected Jiraiya so much that he decided to bring him back to life through the medium of Kashin Koji, then why on God's green earth one of Amado's creations tried to kill Naruto, Jiraiya's only living student? Somebody who embodies the ideology and mentality of Jiraiya possibly better than anybody else in existence, minus the peeping on women thing, which is probably better. But even though Amado is a highly suspicious character whose motivations we don't fully understand, or at least I'd like to assume we don't fully understand, he swears to Kawaki that Akebi won't Otsutsufy. And quite honestly, I believe him. See, because let's assume hypothetically that Amado is pulling the wool over Kawaki's eyes. Amado understands completely that when Akebi gets karma marking, she's gonna begin to Otsutsufy. That wouldn't be good for Amado or Akebi. Like we established, the Otsutsufication process takes time. And if Kawaki identifies that Akebi is Otsutsufying at 1, 2, 5, 10, 20% of her process, he's just gonna kill her, and then boom, Amado's at square one. And sure, Amado said that if she began to Otsutsufy, Amado would battle against Kawaki at the fullness of his extent. Unfortunately, I don't think the fullness of Amado's extent, at least based off what we've seen, is gonna be able to stand up against a fully offensive Kawaki. And yes, Amado obviously does have the shut-off switch for Kawaki that he could probably bust out if Kawaki did try to kill Akebi, but I'm gonna assume now that Kawaki understands that there's a shut-off switch for him that Amado has, he's gonna do everything in his power to make sure it doesn't affect him anymore. And when you consider the fact that Kawaki is currently considered immortal from his ridiculously high defensive abilities right now, if you convert all of that power into offense, he's gonna be a problem. So what if Amado knows that Akebi isn't going to Otsutsufy because he's done this before? Nick, what do you mean, you're asking? Do you mean that that Amado's placed a karma marking on an Akebi clone previously and she didn't Otsutsify? No. Not really. But what I am implying is that Amado has placed the karma marking on somebody previously that didn't lead to that person Otsutsifying. So who is that person, you ask? Well, none other than Code. See, I want to talk to you for a second about Code and his white karma marking. A karma marking that operates nothing like anything else we've seen in the Boruto manga. A karma marking that apparently gives Code all of the power of Jigen, but none of the resurrection. A karma that kind of works like Kawaki's current karma, and a karma whose beginning not only doesn't make a lot of sense, but is also possibly inaccurately reported on. See, from what we know from the Boruto manga, Jigen placed the karma marking on both Kawaki and Ko. The karma marking took to Kawaki and he was able to successfully control its power and survive the implantation process. And while Code kind of underwent the same scenario, Code got a white karma marking. A karma marking that allowed Code to purely access the power of Jigen, but not to serve as a resurrection vessel for him. But all of this is kind of fishy. See, Jigen establishes to us pretty early in the story that he only needs one karma vessel to resurrect. And Jigen gets that. When Jigen places the karma marking on Kawaki, it's a successful implantation. However, Kawaki elucidates to us that when he gets the karma marking implanted on him, there was only 2 kids left. One was him and the other was Code, which means that after Jigen identified that he already had a karmic vessel ready to reincarnate into with Kawaki, Jigen continued on and for some reason placed a karma marking on Code, even though Jigen understood that he would only ever be able to reincarnate in one of them. Which, like, obviously can make the argument here that Jigen already had the kid in a bag, he might as well try and place a karma marking on him. And on top of that, having more options is never a bad thing, as Jigen could just select the one of the 2 of them that he had better compatibility with, or who was just stronger. However, there's things weird about Code's white karma marking outside of the fact that it's a different color than Kawaki's. There's also the fact that out of all of the children that we saw get karma markings, even those who failed, their markings were all eerily familiar to the ones that we see grow on Kawaki. However, Code's karma markings are not only not the same color as Kawaki's, but also not the same pattern. On top of this, even though Code technically fails the karmic implantation, he survives the process. A process that the failure of which had led to the death of so many children that Amado literally lost count. And the craziest part about all of this is that the person who narrates to us that Code gets a white karma marking from Jigen is Kawaki, who got his karma marking before Code and is self-admitted to being passed out cold while Code was getting his karma marking from Jigen. And thus the person who's telling us that Code got his karma marking from Jigen technically wasn't conscious to see that exact thing happen. On top of this, it's established very clearly, like literally in bold lettering, that when an Otsutsuki uses a karma marking to revive, all other karma in bold letters in the manga implanted in other vessels are immediately and simultaneously erased altogether, no matter how many vessels exist. And then it is bolded that this is a strict karma rule. And therefore you have to ask the question, why when Ishiki decided to reincarnate using Jigen's vessel, did Code's karma marking not also disappear? And the answer that most people give you is that Code is not a vessel and therefore does not qualify under this strict karma rule. Yes, Code has a karma marking, but no, he's not a vessel, and therefore his karma marking should not disappear. But Code not being a vessel of any sort is kind of weird, because in order for us to believe that, we have to buy into the logic that Code is not enough of a vessel to serve as a reincarnation vessel for Ishiki, and therefore not enough of a vessel to lose his karma marking after Ishiki reincarnates through Jigen, but also that Code is enough of a vessel of Ishiki to summon his soul to him after Ishiki's death. On top of this, fundamentally how the white karma marking works is never really explained. See, yes, when Ishiki is summoned to Code's side as a soul talking to him after his death, he says to Ishiki that white non-vessel karma is my legacy residing in your palm in the version of pure power, but Code's not Otsutsufied. See, the Otsutsufication process only happens when somebody can become a vessel. So how exactly is Code getting this power from Ishiki? Tie this into the fact that Code doesn't use any of the abilities that Ishiki used. Not Tsukune Ikona, not the Daikoku Ten, not shrinking, and in fact the only real abilities that Code have tie their roots either back to Shibai or Amado, as Code's able to use shinobi-ware augmentations to turn his hands into giant claws, and use those giant claws to launch claw marks, which is an ability that ties back to Shibai Shinjutsu, and the idea that Code's getting any power from from Ishiki becomes immediately kind of confusing. He doesn't have Ishiki's abilities, he's not Otsutsufied, so where is the power coming from? But we do know that Code's white karma marking is making him more powerful. In fact, it made him more powerful than Jigen, which is why limiters had to be placed on him in the first place. But why is Amado able to limit the power of a karma marking that Jigen put on Code? Yes, it makes sense that Amado would be able to augment the power of the karma marking he placed on Kawaki because he placed it on Kawaki. But if the only track record for limiters being placed on people, or the limiters were placed on Code and Kawaki, wouldn't it make more sense to assume that the reason that Amado is able to augment both of them is because he's responsible for both of their karma markings? Now, some of you are probably asking the question,
Wait, Nick, how do you know that Code isn't Otsutsufied?
well, it's never 100% established that Code is not Otsutsufied. One, Jigen never considers him a legitimate sacrifice for 10 tails to turn into a divine tree, and two, Ada's charm Shinjutsu works on him. And yet he had to get his power from somewhere. And thus, what if in actuality, the real reason that Amado was so sure he would be able to recreate a weapon-only karma for Kawaki is because he had done it previously? But here's the thing, the weapon-only karma that Amado gave Kawaki is not a weapon-only karma. It does contain a backup file, just not for an Otsutsuki, but rather his daughter Akebi. On top of this, do you guys remember when Ishiki appeared to Code? For some reason, there was steam billowing out of Code's karma marking and flowing around Ishiki, a kind of steam that we've seen before, specifically from shinobi scientific wear techniques, like when Delta's chakra absorption eye overheated after Naruto shoved a massive Rasengan into her face, or Kawaki's entire body after we saw him battle against Garo, the guy with the metal claw laser hands. In both of these scenarios, we saw these shinobi wear augmentations overheat and emit this white steam, exactly comparable to that of what we saw from Code. On top of this, by Amado's own admission, Code is incredibly easy to manipulate and not that bright. And Amado fully understands that Code has a religious-like love for the Otsutsuki and would do anything that they wanted. And thus, hypothetically, if Amado was able to manipulate Code into believing that Ishiki was telling him to do something, Amado would understand that Code would do exactly that thing, which makes the apparition of Ishiki that Code sees after Ishiki's death all the more suspicious. Because while Amado absolutely has the scientific chops to make Code's karma marking project Ishiki after Ishiki's death, there's also a relatively important name left out of the list of people that Ishiki wants Code to kill when he's visiting him after his death. See, when Ishiki visits Code, presumably through the power of Code's karma, he tells Code to kill, and I quote, Kawaki, the traitor Amato, Uchiha Sasuke, the Hokage Naruto, and Uzumaki Boruto. 5 people, and arguably these are 5 of the most important people in Ishiki's defeat, and so it would make a fair amount of sense that these are the people that Ishiki would want gone. However, rather interestingly, you know who's not on that list? Kashin Koji. But why? Why would Kashin Koji not be on that list? Are you gonna say because Ishiki thought that Kashin Koji was dead? Because that's not true. Ishiki is actually the only person who knew that Kashin Koji was still alive. And Ishiki was very obviously clear on the fact that Kashin Koji betrayed him, as he quite literally lit Jigen as a vessel on fire using the fires of Samadhi and forced Jigen into using Jigen as a vessel for Ishiki's reincarnation. So why would Ishiki, who knows that Kashin Koji is still alive and knows of his betrayal, sick Code on Amado but not Kashin Koji? And the answer to that question could be because it wasn't Ishiki. So you know who didn't know that Kashin Koji was alive after his fated battle against Jigen? Amado. In fact, we see in Two Blue Vortex the moment in which Amado realizes that Kashin Koji is still alive. This moment is obviously well after the projection of Ishiki tells Code to kill those 5 people. So did Ishiki just forget Kashin Koji? Did he forgive him for his betrayal? Or was it not Ishiki to begin with? And before any of you are like,
Oh, Amado doesn't have the technology to project Ishiki out of Code's palm.
mind you, Amado made the toads that Kashin Koji has, and Kashin Koji literally has a projector toad. So what does all of this mean? Well, if you're following along with my line of logic here, which is absolutely influenced from a Reddit post from 3 years ago by a user by the name of TJNW17, who elucidated all of the white karma marking points that I've made up until this moment, but this is where Nick retakes the reins. And fundamentally what I'm saying here is that Amado is actually the person who placed the karma marking on Code, and that in actuality, this karma marking never had anything to do with Ishiki. And this is why Code's power had to be limited. See, because while yes, Code was 100% loyal to Ishiki, as a non-vessel who technically wasn't related to Ishiki at all, Code had to be kept in check. And this is why Code never Otsutsufied, and it's why Code was never able to use any of Ishiki's abilities. Because Code isn't a backup for Ishiki, he's a backup for Amado. Think about how singularly focused Amado is on the idea of bringing Akebi back to life. You think that he would see a resurrection technique and not try to use it for himself in order to make sure that he survived long enough to bring Akebi back. But because this, Amado understands the exact power of a human-tied karma marking. See, if Amado was able to give Code so much power with the white karma marking that his power needed to be put in check because it exceeded that of Jigen's, and that karma marking tied its roots back to him and not the Otsutsuki, Amado not only technically wouldn't be lying when he told Kawaki that Akebi would not Otsutsufy, but also wouldn't really have any real reason to worry because of the power he knows is capable through something like a white karma marking. And thus, if hypothetically the situation ever came to pass, Amado could use Code as a vessel of resurrection, which mind you is about the only good thing Code could be used for at this point in the story, as it's already been established that even the lowest level of Shinju are stronger than him, which means that Boruto and Kawaki are going to far surpass his power in short order, and therefore he stands no more legitimate threat in the story and therefore holds no value as an antagonist, and thus really the most important thing he could do plot-wise is be used by somebody else, and that somebody else could be Amado. And if we're going through the line of logic here that the white karma marking was placed by Amado on Code, that means that the directive to kill Boruto, Kawaki, Naruto, and Sasuke came from Amado himself. Now some of you are probably saying, but Nick, in that directive Ishiki also says to kill Amado. Yeah, Amado's old, and Code has had that karma marking for years. Upon Amado's death, he would simply resurrect into Code, which is almost definitely why when Code slammed Amado against the wall and tried to get Amado to get rid of his limiters, Amado didn't put Code to sleep like he did with Kawaki, because that situation wasn't technically as dire as the one he was in with Kawaki. Now, if we're going through this line of logic, that means that Amado wants Naruto, Kawaki, Boruto, and Sasuke dead. But as to why, I can't really say. Now, the obvious line of logic here would be to say that Amado and Akebi are the two lost Otsutsuki. But fundamentally, that doesn't align with this theory, as if Amado and Akebi were long lost Otsutsuki, then the karma marking that Amado placed on Code would have Otsutsufied it. Now, you could technically make the argument that what we've heard about the white karma marking isn't 100% inaccurate, and that Amado placed his karma marking on Code with the hopes that it would turn into a regular karma marking, but it didn't, which is why it has a unique shape, different from that of Ishiki's. But then that would mean that Akebi is also an Otsutsuki, and therefore the second that Kawaki places his karma marking on Akebi, that she will begin to Otsutsufy. Now that is technically a possibility, but to me it just doesn't feel right. But I'll tell you right now, the idea that Amado is the controller of the karma marking on Code does feel right. And the idea that some versions of Code and Akebi are going to be the final villains of this story, and it's all going to tie its roots back to Amado, does also feel right. But I'm struggling to find a motivation, which is why for the first time in a long time, I'm going to recruit your help. Using everything that I just told you right now, what do you think Amado's motivation would be? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I know, it's my job to give the answers, but I'm kind of stumped on this one.